Princess Alara had always understood that her heart was never truly her own. From the moment she turned 13, her future had been bartered away, her hand not a choice, but a pledge, a tool of diplomacy rather than affection. She had long accepted that love was a privilege reserved for women without crowns, not for heirs born into the weight of legacy. Her mother, with quiet resolve and unbending certainty, once told her that queens do not wed for longing, but for loyalty. Desire was fleeting, duty was eternal, and if fortune was kind, perhaps affection would take root eventually, fragile and defiant, like a flower blooming in the hard frost of winter. And so when the emissaries of Thornville arrived bearing scrolls, silver, and the proposal of a union, she didn't flinch. She signed her name with a hand study from years of practiced silence. Even as her stomach turned, the offer was generous: peace, trade, protection. But it came with a name that made the court whisper: Sir Adrien, the kingdom's most formidable knight. Tales of their valor spread like wildfire in war camps and markets alike. A warrior who had slain beasts, defended villages, and single-handedly led a charge that turned the tide of battle in the Black Valley. But what made the stories linger wasn't the blood or the glory. It was the helmet. Sir Adrien, it was said, never removed it. Not to eat, not to sleep, not even to pray. Some believed the knight bore a face marred by flame. Others swore it was a vow of silence or a penance for sins long buried. Whatever the reason, no living soul claimed to have seen the knight's face. When Alara asked her ladies-in-waiting what they knew of him, they exchanged nervous glances and murmured half-myths. None had met him. None had heard his voice. Still, the treaty was signed, the wedding date set, and 1 week later, Sir Adrien arrived at the royal palace. Alara watched from the high balcony as the procession wounded through the gates, banners snapping in the wind. Her breath caught when she saw her, or rather the imposing figure clad in steel, atop a midnight stallion. The armor gleamed untouched by dust or time, and the helmet reflected the sun so fiercely it was as if the knight wore fire upon her head. She did not wave to the crowd. She did not bow, but when she looked up directly toward her, something deep in Alara's spine throbbed. That night, they dined together for the first time. She sat across from her, perfectly still, speaking little, but listening with a kind of intensity that made her pulse quicken. Her voice, when she used it, was low and smooth, not cold, but restrained, deliberate. "I am honored to meet you at last, Your Highness," she said as the candles flickered between them. "You may call me Adrien." She smiled politely. "Only if you'll call me Alara." She inclined her head. "Then it will be my honor, Alara." Her gloved hand rested near hers on the table, never reaching, but close enough that she felt the heat of her presence. She found herself leaning in without meaning. Too, she asked about her studies, her thoughts on the grain crisis in the East, her opinions on poetry and swordsmanship. When she mentioned that she had trained with a blade until her governess deemed it unladylike, she let out the smallest huff of amusement. "You would have been formidable," she murmured. "Still might be." She narrowed her eyes. "Do you just—" "Never," Adrien said. "I found that a sharp mind wields more power than any blade." She should have found it absurd, this courtship, conducted with a woman in full armor, face hidden behind polished steel. But instead she felt a strange lightness in her chest. She looked forward to their meetings, brief though they were. Adrien was always respectful, always distant, but something in her posture, the tilt of her head when she spoke, the way she lingered half a step behind when escorting her through the gardens, it spoke of a softness, a silent gravity that pulled at her. And the way she listened to her, truly listened, with no interruption, no correction, no patronizing smile. It made her feel seen, in a way no nobleman ever had. Once in the rose courtyard, she turned to find her already looking at her helmet, tilted slightly. "You always wear it," she said without thinking, "even in the sun." "It's part of me," Adrien said. and perhaps a shield from expectations. She studied her. What would happen if you removed it? She was silent. Then all truths have their time. You will know mine when it is safe. She wanted to press. She wanted to rip it from her head and demand to know the truth behind the echo in her voice. The stillness of her body, the way she carried her gaze like a weight. But she didn't. Instead, she said softly, I hope I'm worthy of it, of the truth. Her gloved fingers twitched. You are already more than I deserve. Her throat tightened, and she hated herself a little for wanting to reach out and touch steel and not mind the cold. Months passed and slowly, impossibly, she forgot the bargain of it all. She found herself smiling when she approached, laughing when she made some dry comment under her breath. Her chambermaid said she glowed. She said nothing. On the eve of the wedding, she could not sleep. She stood at the window in her nightgown, staring into the dark, wondering what face waited behind the metal, wondering if her heart had already chosen. And when the bells rang the following day, and she walked toward her, veiled in ivory, her fingers did not tremble. She did not fear what lay beneath. And yet, when the doors closed behind them, and the marriage was sealed with wine and breath, she turned to her in the silence of the bridal chamber and whispered, Will you take it off now? She stood still. Then slowly, silently, her hands rose to the clasps. One by one, she undid them. The helmet lifted, fell away, and her heart stopped. The helmet fell to the floor with a dull, deliberate sound that echoed through the chamber like a bell struck in the heart. Elara stared. Breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat as the woman before her straightened. Slowly, golden hair falling in loose waves from beneath the now absent metal. Her skin was pale, her jawline sharp, her mouth a delicate bow. But it was the eyes that stunned Elara into silence. Blue, not cold or cruel or detached like she had feared, but deep and burning and vulnerable in a way that made her ache. The woman didn't speak at first. She stood still, armor still clinging to her body as if afraid to move. Afraid to break whatever fragile thread now stretched between them. My name, she said finally, voice softer now, unfiltered by metal, is Adrien. Not Adrien, not truly. Elara felt dizzy. She reached for the bedpost, fingers white-knuckled, staring at the stranger. Who is not a stranger at all? You lied to me, she whispered. Adriel's mouth tightened. I did. I had to. They would never have sent a woman. Never have trusted me to lead. I was a knight in everything but name. But they would not have seen me as anything more than a foolish girl with a sword. Unless I wore the armor and the lie. So you lied to marry me. No. Adriel's voice broke. I didn't lie for that. The marriage was political. I never imagined. I never thought I would come to care. She stepped forward once. Stopped. But I do. More than I ever intended. More than I should. Elara didn't move. Her pulse roared in her ears. She thought of every moment they had shared, every conversation, every look, every near touch, and felt her mind folding in on itself. You touched me, she said. You stood so close. You made me believe that I was safe. Adriel finished, pain lacing her words. That you could trust me. And now I have ruined that. Why now? Elara asked. Why tell me tonight? Because you deserve the truth before I took another breath as your wife. Because I couldn't. She swallowed hard. I couldn't live this lie with you. Not when what I feel is real. Silence stretched between them. Then Elara asked quietly, And what do you feel? Adriel hesitated. I feel terrified. I feel like I'm standing at the edge of the world, and the only thing keeping me from falling is the sound of your voice. Her voice was barely a whisper. Now I feel like I've never wanted anything more than I want to be known by you, truly as I am. Elara stepped forward, eyes locked on hers. And who are you? Adriel. The knight exhaled shakily. I am a woman who wanted freedom, who wanted to fight for something that mattered, who saw the cage of her gender and chose the sword instead of submission. I am the same one who listened when you spoke, who saw the sadness you never set out loud, who watched you hold your own walls like armor, and thought she understands. Celeste's chest rose and fell, every breath sharper than the last. You were never going to tell me, were you? If the wedding hadn't happened. I wanted to, Adrien admitted every day. But every day I feared that if I did, you'd walk away. And I couldn't bear that. She took off one gauntlet, then the other, letting them drop gently to the floor. Her hands were smaller than Alara had imagined, scarred, strong, but trembling now. You can have this marriage annulled, Adrien said. No one will question you. I'll take the blame. I'll leave in silence. You will not be dishonored. And you, Alara asked, what would happen to you? Adrien smiled and it broke something in her. I've faced worse than exile. The quiet between them thickened. Outside, a storm began to whisper against the windows, soft rain tapping like fingers on glass. Alara stepped closer. Slowly, her fingers brushed Adriel's jaw. The knight flinched, not from fear, but from reverence. You let me believe, Alara said, that I was wanted. You were, Adrien breathed. You are. Even now, especially now. Their foreheads touched. The air between them was electric and unbearably tender. Adrien didn't move, didn't reach, only waited, trembling like a blade held too long in a storm. And if I asked you to stay, Alara whispered. Adriel's breath caught. Then I would stay forever. Alara tilted her head, kissed her lightly once, testing the reality of her, the taste of her, the truth, and found that it did not burn. It steadied her. She deepened the kiss, hands moving to Adriel's collar to the plates of armor that still separated them. Adrien made a soft sound in her throat as if she had been holding her breath for years. Let me see you, Alara said. All of you. Wordlessly, Adrien undid each clasp, each buckle, letting the weight fall away. Beneath it, she wore a linen shift, damp with sweat and nerves. Her body lean and strong, mapped by old scars and calluses. That told a lifetime of defiance. Alara ran her hands over her shoulders, her sides, her back, learning her without armor, without lies. Adrien stood still, eyes closed as if bracing for rejection. But instead Alara whispered, You're beautiful. The knight looked at her shocked. You're not angry. I'm furious, Alara said, but not because you're a woman. Her voice trembled. Because you made me believe that wanting you was dangerous. Adrien looked like she might cry. It was. It still is. Then we'll face the danger together. She kissed her again. Longer this time, deeper. And when they finally collapsed onto the bed, bodies pressed, hearts unguarded, Alara felt something shift. Not in fear, not in shame, but in recognition. In the morning, the kingdom would demand answers. There would be fury, betrayal, perhaps war. But tonight there was only the truth, and the woman she had married, and the fire between them that could no longer be hidden behind steel. The morning came far too soon. Pale sunlight crept across the marble floor of the bridal chamber, casting soft gold over tangled sheets, discarded armor, and the two women tangled in its center. Alara lay still, one arm draped over Adriel's waist, her cheek resting against bare skin that was no longer hidden behind metal and legend. She could hear Adriel's breathing, steady, though not quite calm, and beneath that, the rhythm of her heart quickened even in sleep. It should have felt strange. It should have felt like a mistake. But instead, Alara felt the terrifying warmth of something real blooming where politics had once lived. When Adrien stirred, her first instinct was to reach for the helmet. But her fingers met only the smooth linen of her shift, and then Alara's hand. No more hiding. Alara whispered. Adriel's eyes opened slowly, uncertainty flickering like a candle in the wind. I thought you might be gone and missed the scandal of a royal morning after, she teased. But her voice caught halfway through, trembling. No, I'm still here. Adriel's expression softened, but tension still clung to her posture. You know what comes next? Elara nodded. The court will be expecting to see Sir Adrien at the post-wedding audience. They'll be waiting to see how we sit side by side as husband and wife, and instead they'll see a fraud, Adrien said bitterly. A woman who deceived an entire kingdom. A woman who saved mine, Elara said, fierce now. A knight who gave her life to protect people who would have never allowed her to hold a sword. And someone she trailed off. Adriel turned her face toward her. Someone you what? Elara swallowed. Someone I trust. Someone I'm beginning to care for in ways I didn't think possible. Adriel blinked. Even now, after everything, especially now. A knock shattered the quiet. 3 firm taps, sharp official. Adriel sat up instantly, already scanning the room for her armor. Elara caught her hand. Don't. Not yet. The voice behind the door belonged to her lady-in-waiting, timid but urgent. Your Highness, forgive the intrusion. The council has gathered. They request your presence in the throne hall immediately. Elara met Adriel's eyes. We don't have time to plan. Then we tell them the truth. If we do, they'll destroy you. Adriel's jaw clenched. Then let them try. But Elara's blood ran cold. She could already imagine it. The king's advisors with their thin smiles and sharp laws. The nobles who had wagered their wealth on this alliance. The scribes, the priests, the soldiers, the people. Her people. They would not understand. And she wasn't sure she could make them. She dressed slowly, carefully. Her wedding gown lay crumpled on the floor like a ghost of promises undone. So she chose a simpler blue velvet, high-necked and unadorned, as if trying to disappear into herself. Adriel stepped into her armor with the practiced grace of someone who had spent half her life living inside it. The helmet remained untouched. Will you wear it again? Elara asked softly. Adriel's fingers paused at the neck guard. If it protects you, and what if it condemns us? Adriel hesitated. Then I'd rather stand beside you barefaced and fall with dignity. The throne hall was already full when Elara entered, the air thick with anticipation. Her father's throne sat empty. He was still recovering from illness. And in his place, Lord Malric presided with smug authority. Nobles turned as she walked. Servants hushed, and beside her, Adriel moved like a shadow of steel, faceless once again. Your Highness, Lord Malric droned, bowing with measured precision. We offer our blessings upon your union. The kingdom rejoices in the strength this alliance brings. Thank you, Lord Malric, Elara answered, tone steady. And where is your new consort? He inquired, looking toward the knight. Surely he will remove his helm now that the vows are spoken. Elara's breath hitched. Adriel stood unmoving. The room grew taut. That will not be needed, Elara said swiftly. Sir Adrien prefers to keep her vow of secrecy off the battlefield. The Chancellor raised a brow. Surely that cannot apply to the throne itself. Another voice joined in. Duke Corvin, a man who had always watched her crown like a trophy. I concur. The people have a right to see the face of the one who now holds half the kingdom's future. Elara's heart raced. She looked at Adriel, who did not stir, then back at the court. Every stare a weapon. Adriel is loyal, she stated. Brave and true. That is what must matter. Perhaps, Lord Malric said coldly. But we deal in facts here, not secrets. He stepped closer. Remove your helm, Sir Adriel. Let the court see the champion they have praised. Adriel turned slowly. Elara could feel the tension thicken. Adriel don't. She breathed. But Adriel reached up, hands shaking. Elara seized her wrist. They'll ruin you. They already will, she whispered. Let it be for something true. And before anyone could react, the helm came off. A hush like doom settled on the throne room. Adriel's helmet struck the stone floor with a clang that seemed to ring on and on. And what came next was not uproar, but worse. Total quiet. Every lord, every knight, every counselor turned their gaze to the woman beside Princess Elara, face now exposed, golden hair resting against the curve of her armor, eyes fearful but steady. Adriel did not speak. She did not have to. Her face said it all. She was not the man they had all praised, not the warrior prince they had traded pacts and promises for. She was a falsehood to them, a blasphemy to some, a danger to most. Elara could sense the court splitting under her, not in clamor or anger, but in something more severe. Reevaluation. What is this? Duke Corvin said, voice thin and hard. Is this some jest of law of custom? Lord Malric stepped nearer, tone sharp. Explain yourself, Sir Adriel. Or is it Adriel now? Who sent you? By whose order have you stood before this court under a false name? Adriel held her head high. By no one's order but my own. A murmur spread through the hall. Then you confessed the falsehood. I confess that I did what was required to serve, to defend, to live. Lord Malric's gaze turned grim. You tricked the crown, tricked this realm, tricked our princess. No, Elara said suddenly, voice slicing through the room like ice. She never tricked me. Not in full. All faces turned. Adriel looked at her, shocked. Elara drew a breath, her posture stiffening, her voice firm. Adriel fought for us long before she stood with me. She commanded your forces. She suffered for your soil. You chanted hymns of her winds. Now you demand her life. She lied. Corvin snapped. That makes her false. She lied to endure a world that would have never let her show her worth otherwise. A woman cannot own title. A woman cannot wed a princess. It is custom. Then the custom is flawed. Elara said. Gasps once more. Lord Malric moved closer. Careful. Your Highness. Am I not heir to this realm? Is it not my right to select my partner within the bounds of tradition? Traditions shift. Not this one. Elara turned to face them all. Then draft a new one. You want accord. You want power. She is mightier than any man in this hall. She won this standing. You are swayed by love. Corvin said. You risk it all. The pact, the lineage, the very heart of this court. I see true, Elara said. Josset. For the first time in my life. Lord Malric's lips twisted with scorn. And what would you have us do? Embrace this sham. Let the people see their next queen bound to a deceiver. She is not a deceiver, Elara snapped. She is my spouse. A pause. Lord Malric looked to the nobles assembled, many of whom now bore looks of thinly hidden dread. Then you allow no alternative. What does that mean? Adriel asked, stepping nearer. It means, Lord Malric said, that the council must gather. Until that time, you are to stay in your rooms. Both of you guards take the princess and her companion to the royal wing. None may enter. None may exit. You would hold us? Elara asked, shocked. We safeguard the realm, Your Highness, even from its own. Before she could object, steel encircled them. Guards she had known since youth now stood like barriers. Eyes downcast, Adriel reached for her sword, but Elara gripped her hand. No, she murmured. Not here. Not yet. And so they were taken from the throne room in quiet, the court observing them go like criminals rather than rulers. The door thudded shut behind them. The lock turned once more. Elara paced the room, rage simmering just below the surface. Adriel sat on the bed's edge, helm in her hands. I should not have removed it, she whispered. You spoke the truth, Elara said, and it lost us all. Would you reverse it? Adriel asked. If you could change it. Elara halted, turned. No, because I would still be here, still picking you. Adriel glanced up. Even now, even if they take your title. Elara walked over and knelt before her. A crown means little if I cannot wear it with you. Adriel brushed her face softly. I would go. I would disappear. Save you this. And I would chase. Do you see? There is no throne, no realm, no title worth more than what I hold for you. Adriel's breath caught. Elara. A knock cut them off. Low, furtive. Elara opened the concealed door leading through the servants' path. One of her former maids stood there, trembling. Pardon me, Your Highness. I should not be here, but they are calling the council tonight. In private. There are rumors that they mean to end all the marriage, strip you of your claim, declare you unfit. What would happen to Adriel? She'd be tried, possibly executed or exiled. Adriel stood. Then we run now. Tonight. Elara's pulse pounded in her ears. If I run, I lose the chance to change everything. If you stay, you could lose your life. I'm not afraid of death, Elara said. I'm afraid of silence. The maid slipped away. The passage closed. Adriel turned to her, anguish written across her face. What are you going to do? Elara walked to the window, looked down at the courtyard. Below. I'm going to walk back into that chamber tomorrow. I'm going to demand the right to speak, and I'm going to make them see the way I do. And if they don't, Elara turned fire in her voice. Then I will burn this kingdom down before I let them take you from me. Dawn broke over the palace with a sky painted in bruised lavender and gray, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. Elara stood before the tall glass mirror in her chamber, fastening the clasp of a deep crimson cloak over her shoulders, the color of queens, of blood, of defiance. Her hands didn't tremble. Not anymore. Adriel sat by the hearth, her armor once more discarded, wearing only her simple shift, eyes fixed on the fire as if searching for a future in its flickering light. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. I do, Elara answered, turning. Because if I don't, someone else will write the end of our story, and they'll make it a tragedy. Adriel rose slowly, crossing the room until they stood face to face. I was prepared to die for you yesterday, she said, voice raw. But I'm not prepared to watch you destroy yourself for me. Elara smiled soft, sad, but sure. Then you'll just have to trust me like I trusted you the night you took off your helmet. A knock interrupted them. Not the brisk knock of a guard or servant, but slow, deliberate. Elara opened the door and found Lady Selwyn, her former tutor, and now one of the few women on the royal advisory circle, standing with her veil pulled low and a bundle clutched in her hands. You'll wear this today, Selwyn said, stepping inside without waiting. The council meets at noon. You'll enter not as a bride, not as a child, but as the heir apparent, and you will not kneel. You knew, Elara said stunned. Selwyn only nodded. I suspected, but now I am certain. And I would rather follow a queen who chooses her heart than a court that chooses its fears. She handed Elara a ring, a signet that once belonged to her grandmother. Heavy, regal, meant for moments that shaped history. Elara swallowed hard and slid it on. Adriel watched from the shadows, her hands clenched behind her back as if she could will herself into stillness. When the doors opened at noon, and Elara entered the Grand Council Hall, silence fell like ash. Every noble, every advisor, every strategist and judge turned to face her. The king's throne remained empty, still draped in velvet while he recovered from illness. At its base stood Lord Malric, cloaked in gold, flanked by dukes and lords whose eyes burned with calculation. Adriel followed her, helmet in hand, but face exposed, walking 2 steps behind, as tradition dictated. But no one missed the way. Her gaze stayed locked on Elara, protective and proud. You come without summons, Lord Malric said coldly. I come as heir, Elara replied, voice steady. And this chamber answers to the crown. It answers to law, Duke Corvin interjected. And law was violated. So judge me, Elara said, stepping forward. Judge us both. Let the court decide whether love is truly the threat you claim it to be. Murmurs rippled through the hall. You wish to speak in defense of your consort. I speak in defense of my right to choose, Elara said, and of hers to live. Lord Malric raised a brow. Very well. Speak. Elara turned to face the gathered court, heart pounding. You speak of deception, of disgrace, of tradition. But what has tradition given us? Wars fought in the name of names, alliances that crumble at the first betrayal, marriages forged in silence and regret. You would have me wed a man I did not know, for peace you could never guarantee. Instead, I was given a choice, a partner, a woman who has risked everything to be more than the world allowed her to be, a knight who fought your battles while you sang songs about the man she pretended to be. You praised her strength, her strategy, her sacrifice until you saw her face, and now you dare to call her unworthy. Duke's voice rang out. She is a woman. So am I, Elara. Snapped. And yet you hand me a crown. If I am worthy of a throne, why is she not worthy of my hand? Because it breaks every law we've known. Then the laws are broken, she thundered, and it is our duty to mend them. Not by erasing what frightens us, but by facing it. Lord Malric's eyes narrowed. You risk your claim. Let them try to take it, Elara said, stepping toward the D's. Let them explain to the people why the daughter they raised, the heir they groomed, is being cast aside for loving too fiercely. Let them try to erase the knight who saved our armies while they counted their coin. I will not beg for my place. I will fight for it just as she did. Adrien stood taller behind her, and Elara felt the room tremble, felt something shift, subtle but irreversible. A voice rose from the council's left. Baroness Thalia, usually silent, stood. I watched Sir Adrien ride through my city during the flood. She carried children on her back and ordered food from her own rations. I did not see a man. I saw a protector. Another voice joined, then another. Whispers turned to agreement. Not everyone, not enough. But a fracture had opened. And in that silence, Lord Malric spoke again. You ask us to amend centuries of law for one love. I ask you to recognize a truth that has already changed the future, Elara said. You can resist it, but it will not stop. He studied her, lips pressed into a grim line. We will vote at dusk. Until then, the princess is to remain in her chambers alone. Elara started to protest, but Adrien reached for her hand, squeezed it. Once quietly, firmly before letting go. We'll wait, Elara said. But I will not kneel. The guards did not bind her. Not this time. She walked from the chamber with her head held high, and when the doors closed behind her, she felt the weight of everything she'd risked settle into her bones like winter. Adrien waited outside, having been barred from entering the deliberation. Well, she asked. Elara exhaled slowly. I planted the match. We'll see if they light the fire. And if they don't, Elara turned toward her, eyes fierce and unwavering. Then we burn it down ourselves. Dusk crept over the palace like a second skin, swallowing the gold of day and replacing it with bruised shadows. In the royal chambers, silence reigned, broken only by the faint ticking of the ornate clock above the hearth and the quiet rhythm of Elara pacing the marble floor in bare feet. She had changed from the crimson cloak into a simpler ivory gown, something soft and unadorned, because she didn't want to look like a queen begging for permission. She wanted to look like a woman ready to walk away from everything. Adrien stood by the window, arms crossed over her chest, still in her armor, helmet resting on the ledge beside her. Her eyes were fixed on the courtyard below, where torch light flickered and soldiers moved like restless ghosts, their moving guards into formation. She said quietly, double the usual number, and not just ceremonial. Elara stopped. You think they're preparing for violence. I think they're preparing for anything. And I think we'd be fools not to do the same. A knock at the door sent both of them into motion. Adrien reached for her blade. Elara grabbed her wrist. Wait. The voice that followed was soft, familiar. It's me, Selwyn. Elara opened the door and let the older woman in. She moved quickly, her expression dark. I don't have much time. Listen carefully. The vote is not going your way. Lord Malric has rallied the southern dukes. Duke Corvin has offered incentives to the coastal houses. And someone has offered them something better than scandal. Elara's heart dropped. What do you mean? Lady Selwyn hesitated. They've begun circulating a letter. A forged confession alleging that Adriel seduced you as part of a plan to seize the throne. Herself. That she poisoned your mind, manipulated your emotions. They're calling her a user, a traitor. Adriel laughed. Bitter and quiet. Clever. Let them cast me as the villain. It's easier than admitting they simply can't accept the truth. It's not just rumor. Lady Selwyn said there's a plan in motion. If the vote goes against you, and it likely will, they won't just eat all the marriage. They'll arrest her on charges of sedition, possibly treason. And me? Elara asked, her voice like ice. You'll be spared out of mercy, or pity, or calculation. Then, they don't know me at all. Lady Selwyn stepped closer. Eyes sharp. If you want to survive, you have to leave tonight. Both of you. I've arranged horses. Disguises. I can buy you enough time to cross the border into Valdaren. Once there, you'll be out of reach. Adriel shook her head. We don't run. This isn't cowardice. Lady Selwyn said. It's survival. Elara stared at the hearth. Her mind raced. Fire roared inside her chest. If I run now, they'll rewrite everything. They'll call it weakness. Call it shame. They'll erase what we are. And if you stay, they may kill her. Lady Selwyn snapped. They won't touch her, Elara said. Not while I still wear the crown. Adriel turned toward her, voice low. If they come for me, don't interfere. Don't ask me for that. Promise me. No, Elara. I said no. Silence fell between them, thick and trembling. Adriel stepped forward. Then promise me this. If it all falls apart, if I fall, keep going. Keep fighting. Don't let them win. Elara reached up, cupping her face, pressing her forehead to Adriel's. I would rather fall with you than rise without you. A knock came again, this time harder. The guard captain's voice followed. Your Highness, the council awaits. Adriel reached for her helmet. Elara stopped her. No, not this time. She took Adriel's hand, laced their fingers. They want to see who we are. Then let them look us in the eye. Together, they walked through the palace corridors, flanked by guards who did not meet their gaze. The doors to the council hall opened slowly, and the room was packed. Advisors, nobility, clergy, all standing now, none seated, as if waiting for the execution instead of a verdict. At the center stood Lord Malric, scroll in hand. His face was unreadable. You may speak, he said. Elara did not flinch. We stand before you not to beg, not to plead, but to claim what is already ours. This union is not a threat. It is a beginning. The crown does not fear progress, and neither should you. Murmurs, scoffs. Then Lord Malric read aloud. The Council of High Lords has cast its vote. By a majority of 16 to 9, the marriage between Princess Elara and the individual known as Sir Adrien is deemed unlawful, invalid, and void. Furthermore, the Knight Adriel of Thornvillen is hereby stripped of title, declared an enemy of the realm, and subject to immediate arrest. The guards moved before Elara could even blink, but she stepped in front of Adriel, voice sharp as a blade. You will not touch her, Princess. Lord Malric said. Stand down. No. Then we will use force. Adriel moved to pull her back, but Elara didn't yield. You'll have to cut me down first. The room froze. The captain of the guard faltered. One of the younger knights lowered his blade. Lord Malric's face twisted. This is treason. Then let me be treasonous, Elara said, daring him. The air crackled, and then a scream, sharp, Unexpected, echoed from the hallway. A second later, a guard burst into the room, blood soaking his tunic. Assassins. He gasped. Inside the palace, they've breached the west wing. Chaos erupted. Nobles scattered. Guards ran. Lord Malric shouted orders. Elara turned to Adriel, who had already drawn her sword. "This is them," she whispered. "This is the real plan." Adriel's eyes darkened. "They're not just trying to discredit me. They're trying to eliminate us together. Always." They ran from the council chamber, blades drawn, cloak trailing behind them like fire. Somewhere deep in the palace, steel clashed and walls burned. The vote had passed, but war had begun. The flames spread faster than anyone expected, devouring tapestries and crawling up stone walls like serpents made of smoke. Screams echoed through the palace corridors as nobles fled in silk stained with ash and blood. The grand halls of courtly power crumbling into chaos. Elara ran with her hand in Adriel's, the weight of her gown slowing her steps. But she refused to let go. Behind them, the sounds of clashing steel grew louder. Rebels or guards turned traitor. She couldn't tell anymore. "Left," Adriel barked, pulling her through the servants' passage. The narrow corridor was hot, thick with smoke, the air choking in their lungs. "Where are we going?" Elara gasped. "Weapons. Armor. We can't protect ourselves with courage alone." They burst into the old training wing, long abandoned, its racks of swords coated in dust. Adriel moved like a storm, shrugging off the remnants of courtly presentation, and strapping on pieces of old armor that still bore the insignia of a forgotten king. She tossed Elara a short blade. "Stay behind me. If anyone gets close, aim for the leg, not the chest. You're not strong enough for a kill. Slow them down instead. You think I can't fight? I know you can, but I'm not losing you to arrogance." Elara's breath hitched at the fierceness in her voice, and then a crash of wood splintering exploded behind them. The door burst open. 3 men rushed in, dressed not in palace uniform, but in black leather marked by a jagged silver crest. One Elara didn't recognize. Adriel did. Her entire body stilled. "No," she whispered. "Not them." She stepped forward, sword raised. "You're a long way from the border, Commander Darius." The man at the front, broad-shouldered, masked, brutal in posture, tilted his head. "And you're a long way from the battlefield." "Lady Vera." Elara froze. Vera, not Thornan. The truth landed like a stone in her chest. Adriel had never spoken of her family, never told Elara her full name. "You said you had no family left," Elara whispered. Adriel didn't look back. "Because I chose to leave them." Darius stepped into the torchlight, pulling down his mask. He was older than Adriel, his features sharper, colder. "You were promised to the order. You were trained, chosen, and now I find you playing queen with a silk-wrapped royal." Adriel stepped in front of Elara. "Touch her and I will gut you where you stand." Darius laughed, a sound like breaking bone. "You always were sentimental. What do you want?" She growled. "What your crown would not give us. A new ruler, one with blood we can control. You never. We don't need your consent. Only your corpse." He lunged. Adriel blocked his strike with the flat of her blade, metal sparking. Elara backed away, heart slamming in her chest. Another attacker lunged toward her. She remembered Adriel's words. "Aim for the leg," and slashed blindly. The blade met flesh. A scream. Blood sprayed across her gown. She gasped, horrified and exhilarated. Adriel fought with a precision that was terrifying, elegant, fluid, brutal to down. The third grabbed Elara, dragged her backward toward the open doorway. "Adriel!" Elara screamed. Adriel turned, saw her lover in danger, and something in her face fractured. She dropped her sword, ran barehanded, tackled the man to the ground. They rolled, struggled. Elara scrambled for the blade, threw it to Adriel, who caught it mid-motion, and drove it through the attacker's chest. Silence fell thick and wet. Blood pooled at their feet. Elara stared at her shaking hands. I stabbed someone. Adriel pulled her close. You survived someone. There's a difference. What happens now? They won't stop. Not until you're dead. Or, I am. Then we keep moving. But before they could, a slow clap echoed behind them. Darius had risen, sword in hand, blood dripping from a wound in his side, but eyes gleaming. Impressive, but pointless. You think the kingdom will rise to defend your little romance? They're ready to crown your cousin. She's already claimed your engagement was coerced. Claimed you were bewitched. Elara's jaw clenched. She lies. Truth is what we say it is. And the truth is, the heir is compromised. The knight is a traitor. The rebellion is already being spun as a rescue mission. Adriel stepped forward, sword raised. Come any closer, and I will end you. Darius didn't move. Or you surrender. Save the princess. Come with me. Quietly. We let her live. You disappear. Elara's blood turned cold. Adriel don't. But Adriel's eyes met hers. Something broke and shining in them. I can't let them kill you. I won't. If you go with him, I lose you. If I don't, I lose you anyway. You promised. Elara choked. You said we'd face it together. And we will, Adriel said, stepping toward Darius, sword lowering. But sometimes together means sacrifice. Adriel, trust me. She turned her back to Darius, looking at Elara one last time. No helmet, no lies. I love you. And then she dropped her sword and surrendered. The moment Adriel was taken, something inside Elara shattered like crystal dropped onto marble, too delicate to survive the weight of betrayal. The silence in the aftermath rang louder than any battle cry, deafening and merciless. Blood smeared her gown dried against her collarbone, the scent of ash still heavy in her hair. But she did not move. She stood frozen in the echo of Adriel's last words. I love you. And the soft clatter of the sword she'd surrendered. The rebels bound Adriel's wrists with metal cuffs, scorched black with magic. Restraints meant for the most dangerous prisoners. Not the woman who had saved this kingdom with every breath of her hidden life. Elara had screamed, fought, slashed, until her hands bled. But they had overwhelmed her. Darius had thrown her to the ground. His boot on her chest, voice like ice in her ear. Try again, and we'll sever her head in front of you. And so Elara had been still, face pressed to the cold stone, tasting dust and fear and rage. They had dragged Adriel away while she watched, powerless, broken, burning. When she was finally released, the throne hall had already been abandoned. The palace overrun by uncertainty and cowardice. Lord Malric had disappeared. Duke Corvin fled to his estate. No one claimed responsibility. No one offered aid. The smoke from the fires still lingered over the courtyard as if the very bones of the palace mourned. Elara locked herself in her war chamber alone, unwashed, untouched. She refused healers, refused food, sat in silence with Adriel's helmet in her lap, fingers tracing every scratch, every dent, each one a story she had not yet been told. The only ones who dared breach her solitude were Lady Selwyn and a young page from the archives named Joran. They found her on the second night. She hadn't slept, couldn't. They're moving her, Selwyn said, voice tight. At first light across the northern pass under heavy guard. Where are they taking her? Elara's voice was to Dunnan, the fortress beyond the border. No jurisdiction, no hope. Then we bring hope to Dunnan. Elara whispered. Joran, barely more than a boy, stepped forward with trembling hands and a rolled map. There's an old smuggler's route, the forest path between the ravines. No one uses it anymore. Too dangerous. But if you ride hard, you could reach the convoy. Before they crossed the river, Selwyn stared at the princess. You would risk everything. Your title, your life. She risked everything for me. Elara said, This crown means nothing if it costs me her. Then we must act now before word spreads, before they're reinforced. They won't expect me to come. They think I'll hide, that I'll submit. Elara stood, still wearing the stained ivory gown, shoulders squared. Let them see how wrong they were. She disguised herself in leathers from the old armory, pulling on boots that had belonged to her mother's guard, braiding her hair back in the style of queens who had led armies, not tea services. At her waist, she strapped blades. One was ceremonial, one was stolen. When she emerged from the war chamber, the guards still loyal to her bowed, not out of protocol, but out of something deeper, reverence, resolve. A young captain knelt. Your Highness, say the word. We're-eyed. No armies. Elara said. No banners. I go alone. One escort, no more. This isn't a war. It's a rescue. Selwyn's eyes narrowed. You will face a fortress. Just before she mounted the horse, she paused, took Adriel's helmet from the saddle, held it close, whispered against the cool steel. I'm coming. They rode under the veil of midnight. No torches, no crests, only silence and the sharp rhythm of hooves. The cold bit at her skin, the wind lashing her cheeks like penance. She did not sleep, could not. Every moment that passed, she imagined Adriel chained in some dark cell alone, thinking she'd been abandoned, thinking Elara had chosen power over love. She would not let her believe that ever. By dawn, the trees had thickened and the path narrowed into an ancient road of cracked stones. The river lay ahead. So did the convoy. Elara signaled her escort to halt. Through the brush, she could see them. 5 wagons, 20 men. Adriel at the center, bound and gagged. Her face was bruised, but her eyes still burned with defiance. Elara turned to Joran, the only one who had followed her to the edge. Get back to the city. If I don't return by sundown light, the pious, let the people know what was done. And you? I do not return without her. He nodded, tears in his eyes. You are never meant to be just a princess. Elara smiled grimly. No, I was meant to be her queen. She waited until the guards began to eat, waited until their attention drifted, and then she struck, blade flashing, body low to the ground. She moved like wind through fire, cutting, slashing, unrelenting. They shouted, they scrambled, and they fell. But there were too many. One tackled her from behind, knocking her to the ground. Another raised his axe. And then Adriel moved. Somehow she broke her bindings. Somehow she rose. And when her fist connected with the nearest guard's throat, he dropped. She dove for a blade, caught at midfall. And then they were fighting side by side again, backs pressed together, blood and fury and hope. When the last man fell, silence returned. Elara turned. Adriel stood panting, shaking, eyes wide. You came. Of course I came. You're insane. I'm in love. Adriel reached for her. Elara ran to her, and when they met, there was no armor between them. Only skin, breath, tears. You shouldn't have come alone, Adriel whispered. I didn't, Elara said. I came with everything that matters. We can't go back. No, Elara agreed. We go forward. But behind them in the trees, steel glinted, shadows moved. More were coming. Then we run, Adriel said. Elara nodded together. And they fled hand in hand into the forest, into the unknown. The forest swallowed them whole. Branches clawed at their cloaks. Mud clung to their boots. And the cold seeped into their bones like guilt. They ran until their lungs burned, until the sounds of hooves and hounds faded behind them, until only the heartbeat of the earth kept pace. Elara stumbled, falling to her knees in the moss. Adriel was beside her in an instant, bloodied, panting, one arm still half-bound, her fingers gripping Elara's shoulder like a lifeline. We can't stop, she whispered. They'll follow. They're already following. Elara gasped. but we need rest, or we'll both collapse. They found shelter beneath the broken remnants of an old hunting cabin. Its roof caved in, its hearth long cold. Adriel gathered what she could for a fire, her hands trembling with exhaustion and pain. Elara leaned against the stone wall, watching her move, still in disbelief that they had survived. "I thought I lost you," she murmured. "You did," Adriel said softly, "but I found my way back." The fire sparked reluctantly to life. They sat side by side, knees touching, faces bruised and hollow. The silence between them was different now, not the stillness of secrets, but of survival, of knowing there were no more masks to wear. Elara took Adriel's hand and turned it over, tracing the faint scars on her knuckles. "I never asked what your real name was," she said. "Adriel. And if I'd known, you would have seen the bloodline, not the girl who broke from it." "No," Elara whispered. "I would have seen both and wanted you anyway." Adriel swallowed hard. "Do you think they'll believe it? That we ran because we love each other, not because we wanted power?" "They'll believe what makes them feel safest," Elara said. "And the truth rarely does." That night, they held each other like armor. No words, no promises, just breath and pulse, and the quiet knowledge that morning might bring ruin. And it did. At dawn, a falcon found them, one of the royal messengers trained to hunt the scent of its intended. It carried a scroll sealed in black wax. Elara recognized the mark of Lord Malric. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Adriel read over her shoulder. The message was brief, ruthless, direct. "Princess Elara of House, you are hereby declared absent from the throne and in violation of royal law. The Council of Heirs has been convened. Your cousin Serenia has accepted provisional stewardship of the crown. Should you return alone, your safety and status shall be restored. The knight Adriel, known also as Sir Adrien, shall be charged with treason and executed upon capture. No exceptions." The seal at the bottom gleamed with cruelty. Adriel exhaled slowly. "Well," she said, "that merciful." "It's a trap," Elara said. "If I return, I validate everything they said about you. And if you don't, they erase you completely. They've already started." Adriel turned to her. "Then you go back." "What? You go alone? Reclaim your throne? Tell them I kidnapped you. Tell them I bewitched you. Let them believe it. But live." Elara stood, the letter crumpling in her fist. "I would rather die at your side than rule alone." "I won't let you," Adriel said. "You have a voice, a crown, power to change things. Not without you. Then change the world so it can have us both." "They won't allow that." Adriel stepped closer, cupping her face. "Then make them." "How?" "Use the one weapon they fear most. Truth." Elara closed her eyes, tears hot and angry. "You keep asking me to leave you and I keep saying no. Because you're brave and foolish and in love. So are you? That's why I know what must be done." They didn't speak again. Not for a long time. When night fell, the wind shifted. Hounds were coming again. Metal clanged in the distance. They were out of time. Elara watched Adriel pack their few supplies, her movements quiet and efficient. "We can run again," Elara said. "There's always another forest." "No," Adriel replied. "There's only one place where we can win. The palace, the court, the throne, the truth." Elara looked at the letter once more. Then she knelt before the fire, tossed it in, watched the flames devour the words. "Then we go back. Not to beg, not to kneel, but to fight." Adriel looked at her, eyes wide. "You mean it." "I do. You're either incredibly brave or mad." "Both," Elara said, rising. "But I'm done hiding, even if it means the end." Elara met her gaze. "Then we end it together." In the distance, a horn blew. They were out of time and out of options. Adriel extended her hand. Elara took it, and together they turned toward the path that led not to freedom, but to fire. They arrived at dawn, not in secret, not under shadow, but through the main gates of the capital, riding side by side on horses strewn with mud and sweat, their silhouettes rising like ghosts from legend. No army flanked them, no banners flew, and yet the city stirred as if it could sense the tremor of history shifting in its foundations. Windows opened, doors creaked, people spilled into the streets, not to jeer or throw stones, but to watch. Whispers chased their path like wind. The princess has returned. The night lives. They came back. No one dared stop them. By the time they reached the palace steps, Lord Malric and every remaining noble stood waiting. The royal banners had been changed. The crest of Alara's cousin, Sir Adrien, now flew above the gate. It did not matter. Alara dismounted with the grace of a storm held in flesh. Adriel followed, armor dented but polished, helmet in hand, her sword sheathed but present. They climbed the steps without pause. The hush of the crowd like breath held before a plunge. "You are not welcome here," Lord Malric said as they reached the D's. "And yet we came." Alara answered, voice calm but sharp. "This is no longer your court," he said. "You have forsaken the laws of the realm. Your claim is void." "Then let the realm say that to my face," she said. "Not cowards behind parchment." The great doors to the throne hall creaked open. Princess Alara turned. "Let them in," she ordered. "Let the people hear what you hide." The guards hesitated, but one, young, trembling, with a scar over his brow, stepped aside and flung the doors wide. The people flooded in. Farmers, bakers, healers, soldiers, servants, hundreds of them. No one stopped them. Not anymore. The nobles recoiled as commoners filled the marble floor. Princess Alara stepped to the center facing the court. "You tried to erase me," she said loud enough for all to hear. "Tried to write over me like a mistaken ink. You forged lies, declared me mad, claimed I was bewitched. You offered me mercy if I betrayed her, if I denied the truth of what we are." She looked to Adriel, who stood tall beside her. No helmet to hide behind. "But I do not regret our love. I regret every moment I let fear dictate my silence. Today I reclaim what is mine, not just the throne, but the voice you tried to silence." Duke Corvin scoffed. "A throne cannot be reclaimed by poetry. Then let it be reclaimed by the people." Princess Alara said, "Let them choose who they will follow." She turned to the crowd. "You know me. You've seen me walk your streets. You've bled under banners I raised. You've sung songs of the knight who defended our borders. Now you see her face. Will you deny her valor because of it?" Silence. Then a voice. "I remember her." A woman stepped forward. Baroness. Battle-scarred. Her sleeve pinned where an arm used to be. "She carried me from the trenches when my horse fell." No one else stared. "I don't care what she is. I'd follow her into fire." Another voice. A blacksmith. "She saved my son during the river breach." A soldier. "She stood in front of my blade when I faltered. Called me brother." A dozen more. 100. Then cheers. Then chants. Adriel. Princess Alara. Queen. Love. The chamber trembled. Lord Malric paled. "This is treason." "This," Princess Alara said, stepping toward him, "is truth." Sir Adrien stood behind him, eyes narrowed, mouth tight. "You would risk civil war over your heart." "I would risk nothing," Princess Alara said, "because I already won." She turned, held out her hand. Adriel took it. The entire court watched as the knight knelt, not in surrender, but in devotion. Princess Alara smiled. "I have one vow left to speak." She looked to the people, to the nobles, to the court. "You may keep your titles, your land, your old ways, but this kingdom belongs to those who fight for it, and I will fight for justice, for peace, and for her." The throne behind her stood empty. She stepped past it. "Burn it if you must. We'll build another." No one stopped her. Lord Malric lowered his eyes. Sir Adrien said nothing, and the people cheered, not out of duty, but out of love. That night, under the open sky and the roar of 1,000 voices, Princess Alara and Adrien stood before the kingdom, not as princess and knight, but as partners, equals chosen. Princess Alara wore no crown. She didn't need one. Adrien wore no helmet. She didn't need it. When they kissed, it was not scandal. It was history. It was a vow sealed not by gods or thrones or bloodlines, but by choice. Together they reigned, and together they were free.